As we approach St. Patrick's Day, 17th of March, not far away now, only less than a few days. As we talk about St. Patrick, about the life of St. Patrick, and of course who St. Patrick really was. Now, the myth has it that St. Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland, and in fact, St. Patrick could not have drove the snakes out of Ireland because there's no snakes in Ireland to drive out. Snakes could not exist in Ireland because of its cold, wet weather. Now, St. Patrick as well was not Irish. It is believed that St. Patrick was either from Wales or some believe he's from Scotland. St. Patrick was Roman British. St. Patrick was kidnapped by Irish sailors or pirates back around the 4th or the 5th century. Now, Britain was under Rome rulership. It was Rome and Britain, and the Romans seemingly had to defend their territory from opposition, so it weakened their defence, and Irish pirates seized the opportunity and kidnapped St. Patrick. Now, this was back around maybe the 4th or 5th century, as it was coming to the end of Roman rulership in Britain. Now, St. Patrick was kidnapped anyway from Britain, and he was brought back to Ireland as a slave. Now, St. Patrick, to be living in Ireland at that time as a slave would have been very, very appalling, would have been very tough, and he even said it himself in his own words in a book recorded, I think it was the Confession, that he was treated like an animal. St. Patrick spent 6 years in Ireland as a slave. Now, St. Patrick was in the land of the barbarians, as he described in his own words as well. Ireland was a very pagan, Celtic, occultic nation at the time. There was no Christianity in Ireland whatsoever. Now, St. Patrick's dad was a deacon, so he would have, of course, been aware of Christianity. But St. Patrick himself, he wasn't walking with God at that time. But in the wilderness and in his time of slavery, St. Patrick found God. In his 6 years in Ireland, he developed a very close relationship with the Most High, as he seemingly prayed up to 100 times a day, which strengthened his relationship and of course became more receptive to the voice of God. Now, in his 6 year stay, he had a dream that he was going to escape from Ireland. So he did escape. Would have taken him maybe days or weeks to get to the boat of which he had the dream of that he would get on to get out of Ireland. So he eventually reached the destination and met sailors, and they declined St. Patrick for getting on the boat, but St. Patrick kept his faith and they let St. Patrick get on the boat. So St. Patrick was out of Ireland and off he sailed. Now, you can imagine St. Patrick leaving Ireland saying, I never want to come back to this country again. But God did have plans for this man. Now, on the way over, he did not go straight back to Britain. They stopped in France. Now, the pagans that brought St. Patrick from Ireland on the boat seemingly was starving with the hunger and praying to their false gods. They did not work, so St. Patrick called on the true living God, the Christian God, and they came across a swine of pig and they feasted. After that, anyway, eventually St. Patrick ended up coming back to Britain. Now, it seemingly maybe would have took him maybe a month or two to get home. So he would have been welcomed, of course, with open arms. St. Patrick coming back from the land of barbarians, coming back to Britain. It was like St. Patrick coming back from the dead. So, of course, St. Patrick would have been well chuffed about coming back. Now, St. Patrick obviously was studying Christianity in Britain. St. Patrick would have been, of course, trying to find his calling in God. But Ireland was calling St. Patrick, as St. Patrick had a dream about the Irish calling him, the Holy Boy, about coming back to Ireland. So St. Patrick was going to come back to Ireland and preach the gospel to the nation, to the barbarians, to the people that taken him away from his haven in Britain, from his comfort zone, and brought him back to, of course, appalling conditions and being treated like an animal. But he was going to go back to a nation to preach the gospel, to a pagan, Celtic, occultic nation who worshipped false deities, who sacrificed to false deities. St. Patrick was going to go back and evangelize to these people, which his life could have been on the line. But this was not led by the flesh. this was led by the Spirit. St. Patrick, I believe this was the divine calling by the Almighty to send St. Patrick back to Ireland. Now, the gospel had reached many nations among Europe from the Middle East, but Ireland was not one of them. In fact, Ireland was a tough nation. So tough, even the Romans, they say themselves, did not even occupy it, because they were seemingly, when they went to siege Ireland, they were met with people howling like they were demon possessed, and it really scared the Romans so much they froze. Don't know how true that is. And as well, the other story was that Ireland was very cold, wet and windy, and its wild seas and its big cliffs did not attract the Mediterraneans in taking siege and taken captive of the island of Ireland. So anyway, it was a tough nation, but St. Patrick was going to tell this nation, this lost race of people, about Jesus Christ. So St. Patrick did. He went back to Ireland to evangelize to the Irish about Jesus. So as St. Patrick went back to Ireland to evangelize, St. Patrick would have been met with persecution, of course. He would have been met with rejection of the gospel, because it was opposing the pagans, the heathen, about their gods, their false gods. But eventually the gospel was spread across Ireland, and St. Patrick is well credited with bringing the gospel to Ireland about Jesus Christ. Now, there's been seemingly stories that St. Patrick raised people from the dead. Well, not St. Patrick, God raised people from the dead through St. Patrick. There is other stories that when St. Patrick was evangelizing to the Irish, he used to use the shamrock. Now, this is a symbol of Ireland's nationality, and to illustrate this to the Irish, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, to describe the Holy Trinity to the nation of Ireland. So pretty powerful that God used a man who was enslaved by the Irish, who was enslaved in a pagan Celtic occultic nation, full of druids, full of witchcraft, full of sorcery, things that God hated. God used this man, this Roman British slave that stayed in Ireland for 6 years, to evangelize to the Irish. And in that 6-year period that he was kept in Ireland, he would have got used to the Irish culture. He probably would have learned the Irish language, and he would have learned the Irish way. So it would have helped him in a way, knowing how to address and evangelize to the people of Ireland. And I could imagine when St. Patrick was evangelizing to the Irish, he had to have had a sense of humour. Let's get real here, because I think he would have been told where to go if he didn't. But he did, and again, he told the nation of Ireland about Jesus. He evangelized, he led many souls, baptized many souls, and Ireland left their pagan culture, their witchcraft, their sorcery, and it became followers of Christ, going around back around the 4th or 5th century. So it was a very powerful story of St. Patrick. Really is far more interesting than, in fact, the world actually even knows about this man. And yes, St. Patrick was a mighty man of God. There's a prayer that St. Patrick wrote. It's really powerful. I don't know the whole prayer, but it does say something along the lines of Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I get up, Christ in front of me, Christ behind me. Very powerful, very spirit-led. And what about St. Patrick? What I think of St. Patrick? St. Patrick was a man of God, I believe. I believe he was a holy man, and I believe he was spirit-led. And I believe him to go back to Ireland to evangelize to the Irish was only from the divine, only from God himself above, to tell the truth about Jesus Christ. So what a story of a man. He seemingly did die on the 17th of March. He lived a long life. He was buried in Ireland. He done pilgrimages in Ireland as well, fasted 40 days and the walk of Croagh Patrick in Ireland. So yeah, he is a man who is iconic in the nation of Ireland. But unfortunately, many people don't know the real truth of St. Patrick, of really who he was. He was a man of God and a man after God's heart that God greatly used. Anyway, coming to the end of this video, I did hope you enjoy it. And again, if you did, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Do hope to see you soon. Till then, be blessed.
Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ within me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ at my right, Christ at my left, Christ in the heart of all who think of me, Christ in the mouth of all who speak of me. I bind myself today to the strong power of the invocation of the Trinity.